Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War One TV, and I'm going to go straight to Lucy, who's over there live in the battlefield. So, hi, Lucy. Where are you now?
Hey, so me and Olivia are at Bayernwald now. So we are still south of Ypres. If you think of the front line around the Ypres salient, to the south side, it's kind of like a backwards S shape. And a little bit earlier, we were at Hill 60, just to the southeast, and we've kind of followed that S bend round down here to an area known as Bayernwald, or so it's kind of it's another area of high ground, but in this case it's a natural area of high ground rather than Hill 60 which was these man-made kind of these soil dumps from the railway. This is a natural kind of area about 40 meters above sea level, so a little bit lower down, but still really excellent views, obviously, of the Ypres salient. So this area, 1914, the French and German armies here were involved in some pretty brutal fighting, again, to gain that strategic advantage of the higher ground. And the Germans, they won that battle and dug in here in this area, giving them a great view over the Allied front lines. And we're going to take you on a little tour. I'm going to give you a bit of a 1917 experience. Liv's going to get her best camera skills involved and take you for a wander around the trenches. But before I do so, we're in like a little area here that you can see a little. And the reason why we're here is because I wanted to show you this. If Liv points the camera down, and so basically, the Germans had noticed they had these great views over the Allied lines, and they'd noticed these sort of spoils of blue clay which were building up around the British lines, suggesting mining activity, which, as we know, was commonplace in this area. And so they weren't wrong. So what they did was they dug their own mine shafts down. So I think there were 6 here at Bayernwald originally, and in there they installed listening posts to try and disrupt and uncover the British tunnels. So yeah, these are, I mean, they're obviously pretty grim now, but I think there are 4 here now that are in situ here. I could be wrong, actually. It could be just a couple, but there were 6 originally. So it's just a nice little feature. Just wanted to mention it before we head off into the trenches.
Brilliant stuff.
All right. So incidentally, the area is known as Bayernwald because the troops stationed here were from Bavaria, which is obviously Bayern in German. So the earliest trenches were built using wood and sandbags, that kind of thing. But later on, you got this wattle, so these tree branches woven in together, and that's typical of the German trenches. I think one of the first things I just want to mention is just to talk about trench life in general. A lot of the stuff you see in the movies, some of it's quite accurate, but some of it is just not. And I think the overwhelming thing about trench life is just that it was really, really dull. It was really, really boring. You had stand to in the morning, maybe got your rations, got a bit of breakfast, and then the day was really spent sort of tidying up, whether that be cleaning your weapons or trench maintenance. Because as you can imagine, I mean, here at Bayernwald, we're on the high ground, so the trenches were relatively dry, but obviously towards the lower ground, it would have been very, very difficult to keep things clean and wet. And you see in the films this mud, this very unhygienic, cramped conditions. And then in the evening you had a stand to, because obviously at night time was the greater threat of enemy activity. But the overwhelming thing was just that it was quite dull. For the British, you would generally do 4 or 5 days in the front line trench, 4 or 5 days in reserve, and then like a week or so out of the trenches, and that cycle would kind of continue. People weren't in the trenches like 24/7. I know when I was a kid at school, I kind of just thought that like guys were in the trenches for weeks on end. I don't know anybody else, but that was kind of what I got from my education.
Yeah.
On the First World War. And the other thing is, there's kind of like a common agreement really that German trenches were much better constructed than British and French, and that's really comes down to philosophies of being a defender versus an attacker more than anything else. For the Germans, it was, we're going to dig in, we're going to reinforce, and we're going to make ourselves as strong as possible, and it's your job to move us. For the British and French, really their trenches, they didn't want them to be anything more than temporary kind of positions, because they were going to win, they were going to push forward. So you have this kind of this mentality that makes a great difference. And Liv's just showing you here one of these concrete structures. So the ones towards the more front lines, the very front lines were prefab concrete ones towards the back, just regular concrete. But they're very strong. We've got a few more a little along the way that we'll look at. Obviously provided really good protection from enemy shelling and that kind of thing. Really not comfortable though, limited in height, just about 1.2 meters, something like that. So you won't want to be in them for very long. It's part of the reason why, you know, these big sort of great allied bombardments you got, a lot of the times they weren't very effective because the defense is very strong. They did sort of nothing but just really, really annoy the Germans because it was just so uncomfortable and the conditions were so horrible in those dugouts.
And the thing about trench life, Lucy, are we still dealing with a kind of post-Blackadder effect of the idea of people living there, you know, 24/7 for months and years? And is that still affecting them? Because that's what, nearly 30 years old. Blackadder goes forth now.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like I love Blackadder. I love Blackadder goes forth, but that's it's got a lot of questions to answer in terms of our current understanding of that. I'm just going to shine a light in here. I don't know if you'll be able to see, just to give you, probably not. Okay, got a little bit of view just of inside here.
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, this is a pretty good view. I've been inside these on a number of occasions, and I'm absolutely not going to go in it today. And they are really uncomfortable. I did some filming in here a couple of years ago for a TV show, and I was in there for way too long. You know, but I'm talking half an hour, and that was more than enough for me. But yeah, no, just going back to it, Woody, I think you're 100% right about, you know, about the kind of these ideas that we have that come from pop culture, and also, you know, a lot of the soldier memoirs and things like that, kind of obviously more emotive and more emotionally sort of driven than anything else.
So people are asking Lucy about whether or not these trenches are rebuilt or well preserved, or whether it's sort of somewhere in between the two.
That's a great question. So yeah, these trenches were pretty much left after the war, and then were rediscovered in around about 1971. A local school teacher rediscovered them, excavated, and kind of like, you know, did them up, restored them to a point where visitors came. After his death, unfortunately, they kind of went back to rag and ruin, but they were re-excavated in the late 1990s and opened, I think, just around the 2004, something like that, early 2000s. They are, I mean, this stuff needs a lot of upkeep, and they are a bit raggedy again at the moment, so you have to be kind of careful when you're walking around here not to put your foot through the duckboards, you know. But yeah, but they're pretty, I think they're pretty good. They're pretty good reconstructions, and they've been done using trench maps and things like that to be in as original positions as possible.
And it brings up that greater question about when you start restoring battlefields, whether or not they then are still genuine. It's the, you know, the like with the restoration of tanks, it's come up on the past on World War II TV, is that at what point does it become like a film set, and at what point is it still original? And these are things, as the First World War is now over 100 years in the past, that museum and curatorship will have to make these considerations. You know, I know lots of films are done on sets like Taff Gillingham's trench system he has in East Anglia. So, you know, there's authenticity, and there's keeping things preserved. So I guess these are the issues. What's your feeling of someone who takes people to battlefields? How do you explain that what you're looking at is partly recreated, partly preserved? It's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I like these kind of places, I've got to say. I mean, especially here at Bayernwald, you have to book tickets in advance to come here, so that's worth mentioning. You can do it on the day, but you can book them online or at the local tourism office. It's like €5, and you get a time slot to come in. So the thing I like about here is you've got all these original structures, you know, like these like these defences, these blockhouses and dugouts and whatnot, but it's not super busy. Other places like Sanctuary Wood is way more popular. People go there a lot more than here. But for me, that has lost so much of its kind of authenticity that I'm not sure it's worth the visit sometimes. It's good to give you an idea though, right? An idea of things. So,
and people are asking questions about the width of the trenches, because at some point on the channel, obviously we're going to do something where we break down, because there's communication trenches and there's a front position, but the ones you're walking through, are they communication trenches? Are they frontline positions? Give us a breakdown for those of us who know absolutely nothing about this.
Yeah, so these are not, they are part, because obviously when we think about trenches, I mentioned this before, but it's not the frontline trenches are not one single line of trenches. They're kind of You've got several lines all connected by communication trenches, as you say. These aren't the super frontline ones, but they're in that cluster. And you would have had your SAPs and then communication trenches going back and around. But, you know, these things varied, you know, the width and all of that kind of stuff. If you visit different places, obviously, it largely depends on how well that these defences can be built. So the kind of ground you're on, if you look over at places like, you know, in Artois, the water table is so high, you couldn't dig trenches, really. So you had to have breastwork. So sort of above ground trenches, as it were. So there's a lot of variation. I think it's really interesting contrasting British and French trenches. Nice to visit here to get the German views. British and German, I said earlier. Get the German view from here, because it's something that we don't often or talk about as much as we should, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we'll hopefully explore more on the channel when we get to the proper long content. These are just, as we keep saying, folks, these are kind of teasers really for the kind of thing we can bring you in the future, or Lucy will be bringing in the future. So the trenches aren't just trenches like Atlantic wall positions or anything else. There's more than one type, and the variation is key to understanding how the battle is unfolded, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing to mention here that I just wanted to get in before we wrap up is another reason this area is quite famous is it's known for its link to Adolf Hitler. So yeah. Hitler served here as a soldier when he was a dispatch runner in the Reserve Infantry Regiment 16. So it's got that link we were talking about before, Woody, about that link of personnel. You know, these people who cut their teeth in the First World War. Montgomery is another one who comes to mind. You know, I'm really hoping someone's going to come on and do a show about Montgomery, because he was involved in the retreat from Mons. He got shot in the lung and played dead, you know, and was out there until nightfall. And he has this amazing story. And I just think getting that context on the personalities is just a really interesting thing that I'm super excited to learn more about.
No, definitely. And that whole thing about whatever kind of human beings Hitler and I'm using Hitler and Montgomery in one sentence there, but I'm not really comparing them no. But their experience in the First World War had to have shaped how they thought about everything, not just military tactics, but life and death and everything else. And the big subject of gas that will certainly come up over World War I TV and its moral obligations and how people felt about it, and Hitler and gas, of course, is a very complicated subject with lots and lots of facets. But the First World War and his experiences there are going to be interesting because again, the whole point of this is it helps us understand the Second World War by understanding the First War there. So yeah, great stuff. So Lisa Loftus is asking, how far are you away from Camel Hill? Because she's reading about the Mother Bibles. I think we mentioned in one of the book shows about. Is that very close to where you are? I have no idea.
No, it's not that far at all. I wish go out, but if we go through the gate, we can't get back in again. So I'm going to stay in here. But literally at the front of Bayernwald, you look over sort of that direction, you can see Mount Camel there. So, you know, as I said, you can broadly follow this S shape and the mining that went on here. So if we come back to Messines, just talking about earlier. So the Royal Engineers dug three chambers around this area because there was a German strong point here. And though these three mines, like Hill 60, the Caterpillar at Hill 60, they were detonated in June 1917. The Allies were then able to take this position from the Germans, and the Germans actually got it back in their spring offensive in 1918. So again, it's one of those places that changed hands quite a few times because of its high ground. Just before we kind of finish, we'll walk over to the gate just to give you a little view to see that, you know, just that 40 meters above sea level, like what that gives you as a force occupying these bits of high ground, and why, you know, so much bloodshed went on over these places repeatedly throughout the course of the war.
Well, it's one of those facets, whatever war you're studying, is that when people mention high ground, they immediately kind of start looking up and expect to see almost like snow-encrusted peaks. But often high ground just needs to be a little bit higher than the other ground around it, and it can make a huge difference. They're based in Italy, they're based in North Africa. It's come up repeatedly on World War II TV, and high ground is a comparative term, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah, it's higher ground, isn't it, I suppose, rather than high ground.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you, I don't know if you can see. I'm just going to try and just see Camel there, Mount Camel distance.
Yeah, so there you are, Lisa. There's Camel over there, a couple of miles away, something like that. So yeah, I mean, it's been a great introduction to this. I mean, people are starting to ask lots of questions about fire steps and grenade sumps and trench designs. Of course, we could start addressing those questions now, but the point is we'll leave that when we can start showing diagrams, things like that on a future show, because it's a complicated subject at the end of the day, isn't it? And there are, as we said, there are trenches, and the German ones different to the French and different to the British, and of course based on location, because as we talked about water table and things like that. So folks, we will be addressing all sorts of varieties of trench works in the future. It's one of the things will be coming up. So anything else you want to say, Lucy?
No, just that, as I said, like part of the idea of these shows is just to give people a flavour, get your thinking caps on, get your questions going, and I will bring on people far more qualified than me to answer them, because we all have our specialist areas. My specialist area is reasonably uninteresting to most people. It's just horses in the First World War, so I can tell you an awful lot about horseshoes, but not as much about trenches or fire steps as some of the other people that we're going to be getting onto the channel. So hold that thought,
and as someone had just said, Bob Hansen just said, not enough is said about the soil in this area. Totally different experience, whether wet or dry. We could literally bring on a geologist at some point and have and explain practical demonstrations. Africa in Stalingrad on Twitter today was showing how the mud in Tunisia just doesn't come off your boots. So doing some kind of practical explanations about how the mud in one place is different to the mud somewhere else would be really informative, and where we could do practical demonstrations of people standing out there and seeing how the mud works, because mud, like trenches, isn't just mud. There's all different types of mud.
That's it. And just there's so many variables, when it comes to digging trenches or building your defensive positions or whatever. There are just tens and tens of variables that come into play, and I think that's what I want to, no pun intended, but dig into. Good
use of a pun there, Lucy. That was and again, it's the same thing as I'm repeating myself there, is that to get into the depth of trenches, I'm using a pun now, is important, because we have this single image often from movies or from documentaries, and of course getting into the detail about how the terrain affected it is something that we can really get to grips with. And as you said, we could do a week on hill six, we could do a week just on trenches, probably do a month on trenches.
And I think as much as we I know, Willie, when we spoke initially, I was like, the Western Front, and I want to make it international, but you can't ignore the fact that the trenches are a massive part of the First World War, and so it's we've got to give it its due consideration. Another thing is the weather, of course. It's a beautiful day here. We had a bit of rain earlier when we first got here, but it's all very well looking at these things on a sunny day, what about midwinter and all these kind of things, and how did that affect how you excavated sites and all this kind of stuff? So and
human traffic, just how many people moving through these things and living in them on a daily basis, how much effect that has. I mean, that's another aspect about tourism, that the more we allow public to walk around sites, the more public are damaging the sites with their very visit. So it's a complicated issue. Just because I know it's something that you're really interested in, is the civilian aspect of things, because Lisa again is asking about the civilians living in the area. Were they evacuated? Because that's something that we tend to forget when we think about the Western Front, is that there are communities really not very far away. So in principle, that's going to be something we're going to be tackling, I imagine, is the civilian experience, and whether they were evacuated or stayed there, and how they are affected by the war.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, the poor old Belgian people in those early months of the war had an absolutely torrid time. There was no organised kind of evacuation. It was just like refugee situation. Grab what you can and get out, and that's something definitely I want to look at. I really want to do like a series on just those very early days of the conflict. Yeah. And again, it's another thing we could do easily, a couple of months worth of shows just on the civilian experience in Belgium, never mind anywhere else, certainly at this point when all this was kind of here, then civilians majority long gone, because you just couldn't. It's all very well green trees, all this beautiful stuff that we're looking at here. This was not what the landscape was like. You throw up contemporary pictures of the time period, it's you've got to use your imagination.
Yeah. And someone Adrian Wilson brought up the point, of course, is that a lot of World War I army service would not even have set foot in a trench. And that's another aspect, is how much of the war was fought from not at the front line. The use of artillery, the engineers, the bringing up logistics, the trains that came up on World War II TV. So the trench aspect is an important one. It's obviously a focal point. It's where people's imagination goes to. But the First World War, like all of the wars, has a whole tale behind it as well, which possibly is overlooked in the whole complexity of study.
Oh, yeah, the tale of the army versus the teeth. It's an age-old thing that the tail is less glamorous, but obviously the majority of people are in that part, not the teeth. And for my work, you know, a large part of my work is on equines, which majority of which were not in the cavalry, but were in logistics, the mules that were, you know, pulling the supplies, particularly here. So, you know, 1917 here, the Battle of Messines, I would argue, and I have done in papers, that that would not have been won if it were not for the use of mules. You know, never mind all the modern technology, they could not bring the ammunition up to supply troops without mules, because they were the only way that you could carry them. The earth was so badly damaged, motor vehicles were not, you know, in a position to be able to traverse it. So without those, without the mule tracks being laid on the nights before the attacks and going through, and the animals, not just their resilience, but their capability to remember routes, to once they've seen, you know, and heard explosions, to not be bothered by all that kind of stuff. You know, that was a very important aspect of it. So I'm absolutely happy. I think a lot of our shows are going to be on logistics if I've got anything to do with it.
Yeah, no, definitely. And people are reminding us, of course, that we aren't going to be just tackling the Western Front, as you said yourself. There's the Eastern Europe as well, and where, again, it isn't all about trenches there. There's Turkey, where it isn't always about trenches. There's all the other places as well. So we're simply bringing these shows because we can only get Lucy to one location at one time. So you happen to be in the Ypres salient this weekend, but in the future we can bring experts on, hopefully from around the world and different insights. But it makes sense to kind of start with the with the trenches and the Western Front, because it is most people's starting off point for everything else. But hopefully it'll be a starting off point for World War I TV as well, and we'll bring them in with the you know, the bronze swimming certificate with the Western Front, and then move on to the silver and gold as they go on to Eastern Front and the more complicated war globally. So yeah, great stuff. So I love the fact that people are getting, you should be talking, well, let's talk about, I can't wait for this, I can't wait for that. That enthusiasm is fantastic, but it's we will just have to rein ourselves in. Now, I use the horsey pun there, and gradually tackle these subjects as they come up, one at a time, because there's obviously a huge amount there. So thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Liv, for doing this. And I can't wait to bring you, we'll be getting the proper content listed. It'll be the week after next, I think, won't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Okay, so there you are. So, folks, if you haven't already, don't forget to sign up there. Then we have put details. Hi, Liv. There we are. The Patreon details are in the description below, because that will help out. And then at some point, the YouTube membership will kick in when we get to the magic 4,000 hours of views. We're going to hit 1,000 this week, so we're quarter of the way there. So in the next few weeks, hopefully, it'll bring us to the next stage there. So fantastic! This has been really great, and people have enjoyed it. So, any final words?
Oh, just thank you for your support, and and yeah, like I said from the very beginning on this, I am not an expert on everything First World War. I'm just going on this journey with all you guys to just share some history. That's all it is.
Brilliant. Well, folks, we'll see you all again soon. This is Paul, Lucy, and Olivia for World War I TV saying enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Ooh.